What a great day. What exciting conversations. We're going to be buzzing about this all through the wine and cheese hour, which is after this. So I encourage everybody to stay. Our panel is, I think, the largest panel we've had of the day. We've got 5 people. We're going to take just a little bit longer, but I promise you that you will not be disappointed. These presentations on the work that these great folks are doing is really exciting and interesting. And so without further ado, we're going to get to our panel, which is titled Race and Racialization in the Iranian Diaspora. And we've all met. I'm Niaz. You know enough about me, so I won't get into the details. All of our bios, of course, are in your program, so you can feel free to look at that. But I'm super excited about not only being invited to moderate this panel, thank you, but also the fact that we're actually having these conversations today in many ways in the order that we've been having them, because they build off of one another and we can really leverage some of the dialogue that we've already built today. So without further ado, we're going to go in order. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and they'll get about 11 minutes each to make their presentation, and then we'll definitely leave some room for Q&A at the end. And so our first speaker is going to be, her name is Yalzadeh, and she's a PhD candidate at Brown University. She's going to be talking to us about eating the Iranian other, liberal multiculturalism, and American exceptionalism in mixed nuts. So I actually will do this. I'll introduce you. You can make your presentation, and then I'll introduce the second set of panelists. So the floor is yours, Aida.
Great. Thank you so much, Niaz, and to my panelists, and also thank you all so much for sticking it out to the last panel. Yes, hopefully we're going to put on a great show. So, all right. So, branded as the International Peanuts, Mixed Nuts follows a group of children who are of different national and ethnic backgrounds as they navigate issues of identity and heritage in an ambiguous town called the West, in the West called Diversity. We are ushered, We are ushered into a world that takes its precedence from the celebration of multiculturalism and asserts that if we would just talk to each other, we can all get along. Produced by the Vancouver-based Big Bad Boo Studios, Mixed Nuts ran for one 13-episode season, primarily over public television networks throughout the United States and Canada. The show's Iranian-American co-creator, Shabnam Rezaei, stated that its mission was to provide children from marginalized communities, especially those of Iranian heritage, a counter-representation to the antagonistic images of their nations of origin. However, in attempting to normalize these groups within a larger pluralist culture, Mixed Nuts ends up exotifying its subjects through claims to exceptionalism. This is particularly the case with the cartoon's Iranian characters, Babak, Susan, and Saman, who are confronted with their difference in order to show how it can be celebrated. No mention is made, for instance, of why Babak at times feels ashamed to be Iranian, or why the children in his previous school taunted him with the word terrorist. Viewers only see the best that Iran and Persian culture have to offer, namely the food, the consumer goods, and the ancient history, erasing the modern. It is these items that Babak has to offer his multicultural counterparts. It is these items that generate the currency from which he stakes his claim for them to let him be exactly who he is. The show places an unmatched emphasis on the move away from monoculturalism by an emphatic shift towards cosmopolitanism. This is demonstrated by the only white protagonist on the show, Michael, whose own lack of culture outside of, quote, good old-fashioned American food is primarily what prompts the other children to explain their heritage. By performing their heritage, the non-white children on the show exotify and render their culture exceptional. In other words, the articulation of their exceptional difference is what is thought to construct their desirability under capitalist multiculturalism. However, this idealized multicultural desirability is just that, a construction. As scholar Bell Hooks explains in her essay on Eating the Other, this sense of desire and pleasure derived from white people about racialized others should be read as a new form of racial hierarchization rather than a gesture toward a post-racial future. This presentation is part of my larger dissertation project on tracing the racial boundaries of the Iranian diaspora from the mid-20th century to the present. Through these moments of political rupture, I simultaneously examine how Iranians in the United States negotiated these changes through strategies of survival, whether that was performing brownness in relation to third world solidarity or proximity to whiteness through the rhetoric of American exceptionalism. In this moment in the post-9/11 era, I suggest that Iranian Americans seek multicultural acceptance through a performed indebtedness to U.S. liberal empire for the, quote, gift of freedom bestowed upon them, as Mimi T. Wen theorizes. This idea of eating the other is most clearly and quite literally played out in the sixth episode of Mixed Nuts, titled Food for Thought. Its premise centers on Michael, who at lunch with the rest of his classmates realizes that he is the only one at the table with a PB&J sandwich. When he asks his friends what they are eating, they resignedly answer. Jay is having kimbap, Sanjay has samosas, Salman has kuku. And and Babak eats kotlet with lavash, a dish that Michael describes as a, quote, weird sandwich. After no luck with his attempts to trade his PB&J for a less boring meal, Michael asks his mother next morning for, quote, something exotic for breakfast, to which his mother comically replies that they are having French toast. Is that exotic enough? The binary form between boring white and exotic non-white is one that superficially places non-white subjectivities as something that others desire in this multicultural environment. This desire that Michael expresses for the pleasure of having an exotic meal is thus understood to be a progressive stance, one in which encounters and interactions with difference is used productively to recuperate some semblance of identity in the West. That is to say, as Hook states, quote, ethnicity becomes spice, seasoning that can liven up the dull dish that is mainstream white culture, end quote. Furthermore, it is reinforced that the exceptional desirability of these individuals comes in the form of what they can offer to the West, here signified by Michael. This Western desire for the other moves to a fantastical level, with a dream that Michael has in which he very literally is, quote, eating the other. The audience is transported into a world where his classmates physically embody a food that is meant to represent their ethnicity. Damaris, for instance, relays that she is a Cuban sandwich, as her hands, legs, and head stick out of a body made up of bread, roasted pork, ham, cheese, mustard, and a pickle. With his appendages sticking out of a samosa, Sanjay exclaims, "I'm spicy." As the children comment that they are busy being interesting and delicious, Babak offers Michael to, quote, try some of him, offering his back, now a kotlet wrapped in lavash. Michael takes a big bite, quote, you are tasty, end quote, before moving on to take a bite out of all the rest of his classmates. Cannibalism aside, this literal display of the marginalized body for consumption is one that awkwardly fails to present an inclusive picture for the future. Rather, it perpetuates the particular and historically precedented notion of consuming otherness and difference as a means of overlooking the history of racial domination that has created the structures that have led to this particular relationship of desire and pleasure. Each of the children have their culture reduced and essentialized to a single dish of well-known food that is meant to represent the whole of their nationality and or ethnicity, and do so happily. Babak and the other children offer up their bodies for consumption as if they know that this is the price for attaining the gift of freedom in the West, a self-orientalizing mode of becoming. This is the image of a post-racial multiculturalism from which the West seems to benefit from the prospect of diversity and its potential to provide life-sustaining alternatives from which further prosperity may develop. However much Michael has enjoyed eating the other, in his dream, this feeling of desire is not reciprocated. Upon taking a bite out of each of them, Michael's core becomes a piece of white, potentially Wonder Bread, as he asks the others, quote, do you want to take a bite out of me? Much like the scene at lunch, he is hopeful that his classmates will find him just as desirable as he does them. However, the scene follows suit of what took place the day before, with Babak retorting, no thanks, we'll just eat each other, and Damaris commenting, maybe Michael can make himself more interesting. This fantastical refusal is one that on the surface appears to resist the common trope of disgust or indifference toward the other. The non-white children refuse to eat the white bread, which perhaps is meant to take on a valence of resisting the colonizer. However, this dreamed refusal should be understood as such, namely, a dream. This larger notion that this is all in Michael's head is important to reading the implications of this episode and this dream in particular. Just as Malik Alula reads early 20th century postcards eroticizing Oriental women to be the Frenchman's phantasm of the Orient and the Oriental world, so Michael's desire for the food of the other should be understood as his own phantasm of the non-Western world, in which he, as a white boy, is enacting a sort of colonizing violence by dreaming up his friends as food, despite their dreamed refusal of his body as white bread. The refusal is ultimately unreliable as a means of resistance to colonizing forces because its agency and voice does not actually lie with them but in Michael's own head. Furthermore, this dreamed refusal can also be understood as a microaggression on the part of the series producers. By stating that the PB&J sandwich, a stand-in for North America, is boring, the creators are playing into the idea that different cultures are desirable for their exoticism. Superficially, the children's rejection of Michael in favor of their non-white peers may seem like a triumph for the former. Finally, they are in a space where they are able to choose something other than the mainstream. However, when read in the context of American exceptionalism, I suggest that this moment indicates the impulse to show just what these marginalized populations have to offer the United States. Moreover, the United States, and Canada in this case, are understood to be spaces from which these multicultural networks are able to develop. Ultimately, the rejection of Michael is not as important as the excitement with which Babak, Damaris, Sanjay, and Jay share their cultures with each other. Although this may seem like a tangent from the main argument that I have involving representations of Iranian migrants and Iranian Americans in the era of capitalist multiculturalism, Michael's desire for and pleasure deriving from the other is necessary to understanding the larger pluralist systems in which mixed nuts has its characters operate. While producers of the show characterize diversity as an aspect of society that is to be celebrated for its ability to add to the contours of culture in the West, these additions are merely ornamental in this case. Without a look at the historical context from which these antagonisms emerged between the U.S. and the countries that these children represent, the show ultimately reinscribes the understanding that they must perform their exoticism as a justification for being included within the multicultural fold. Although my argument on the lived experience of the Iranian diaspora here is being subsumed by an argument involving a broader conception of racial otherness, I think this exercise is necessary to situating this population within larger narratives involving race in the United States. That is to say, it is by situating Iranians within these broader conceptions of brownness and the racial other that we can begin to complicate previous conceptions of Iranians as merely performing a particular proximity to whiteness. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing, Ida. I know we all have these great questions that the presentation has brought up for us. I know I do, but I'm going to jot it down. If you can do the same, we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. I'd like to move to our next presenters. We're going to have Dr. Sahar Sadeghi from Muhlenberg College and Dr. Yousef Baker from the University of California, Santa Barbara. The topic of their presentation, Liberalism and Racialization in the Age of Rising Far-Right Movements, Reflections on the Iranian Diaspora in the U.S. and Germany. Take it away, guys.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to the conference organizers. I'm actually from Cal State Long Beach, and I just want to say that I think it's really important having an event like this at a Cal State, which is an institution that is embattled at the very same time that it serves students of color and working class students. So I think it's absolutely essential to have the support for this type of place. So Dr. Sadeghi and myself are going to present together. This is a new project, so we use the conference as a reason for us to start talking to each other. So it's really built on a lot of the work that she's been doing for a decade now, interviewing over 88 people in the Iranians in the U.S. and in Germany, and based on my work on the Iraq War, which I've realized is really about the remaking of America, but that's a different story that we don't have to get into now. The central points that we want to make, and I apologize, I'm going to speak really fast, and I'm going to make it very bullet pointy so we could get through it very quickly. So apologies for that. There's four central points that we're going to try to make. One is that Iranians are racialized as Muslims, that the racialization of Muslims is about asserting Western liberalism as a universalist ideal, that the racialization of Muslims in this current conjuncture, in this era, in this epoch, is about creating legitimacy for a neoliberal state that is masquerading as liberal. And that lastly, to avoid anti-Muslim racism, many Iranians distance themselves by asserting difference, such as we're not Muslim or we're not bad foreigners, and thus as a strategy to avoid racism, they actually reify the very racial project that they want to avoid. The method that we're going to use is we want to talk about a specific case study of Silvestre Night 2015, which we argue is the construction of one moral panic amongst many that was used to congeal and to further anti-Muslim racism. So I want to talk about what we mean by race and racism. I know everybody knows about this, but let me quickly say that one is created. It's not real, but it's a construction. That two, it is dynamic, which means that racism changes based on the political, economic, cultural, and social imperatives of the nation state. That third, it is irrational, contradictory, mythical, and most important of all, it is stupid. And then lastly, and I think this is a point that is often missed, when we talk about racism, that it is essentially about creating a racialized subject that is vulnerable to the systematic violence of the state and the spontaneous and erratic violence of the state people, or the neutral non-race subject or whiteness. So that what we're really talking about when it comes to race is the construction of an ideological complex of death and death-making. That Muslim here, so when so if that's the definition of race, to then talk about Muslim racialization, we're not talking about Muslim as a theological category of how many times you pray or how many times you fast, but rather a sociological category of those who become racialized. So what that means specifically for Muslims, for Muslim racialization, it looks like, you know, some things are about phenotypical or outside appearances. So if you're brown, if you wear a turban, this is why you're stupid, because like a lot of our Sikh brothers and sisters are the ones that get attacked for being Muslim. If you wear a hijab, if you're bearded, which I think the hipsters for making that a little bit less visible, or if you wear something like the kufiya. But there's also non-visible ways in which you become racialized as Muslim. So those are things like your name, if you're Muhammad or Ahmed or something. If you're for your national origin, so if you come from a country that is said to be a Muslim country. Also, then those who get racialized as Muslims are those who, for religious reasons, they are actually Muslim, or they follow the faith of Islam. Or for political reasons, if your views are oppositional, if you stand against the sanctions against Iran or the opposition to war on terror, then you become Muslim. So then what does it mean to be Muslim? So the Muslim is not Western, they're traditional and or conservative, they're affective, they're not rational, they think with their emotions, they're anti-modern, they're anti-secular, they're anti-liberal, by liberal meaning that they're against political rights of free speech, assembly, and all those things. They're opposed to pluralism, and they are, of course, prone to force and violence. So that's race. Those are people who get racialized. The current epoch that we live in is the epoch of neoliberalism, starting in the 1970s, and triumphant neoliberalism starting in the 1990s. Neoliberalism is about the subordination of everything to the marketplace. So there's no longer a civil society. There's only individual, and then there's the marketplace. And so based off of neoliberalism, what the state has done is that it has gutted the social safety net. There's no longer a social wage. And so if you gut social safety net, what that has created in the neoliberal states that masquerade as liberal is that it has caused massive economic dislocation, and that people are suffering. Everyday people are suffering. So that studies suggest that people are working harder, are more productive, yet they earn less every day. That economic immiseration then has meant a continuous discontent and a crisis of legitimacy for the state. So what does it mean for a state to exist that doesn't provide any services? So at the same time then that the state has retreated from providing those social safety nets, what the state has done is re-entrenched itself in the coercive apparatus of policing and war making. And that's exactly there that the racialization of Muslims is so important, because what the racialization of Muslims create is the fear that is stoked of Muslims gives the neoliberal state its fundamental purpose today, which is the defense of liberalism, liberal ideals, and of civilization itself. And that becomes even more important in the post-Cold War era, because now the Cold War erased the mythical outside, which was communism, so now you need a new mythical outside, that is the Muslim. That means for everyday Muslims that you're continuously, the Muslim embodies the outside. The places that she comes from are the places of non-liberalism, of non-civilization, and of savagery. No matter where she is, she becomes an extension of those places. At every point, the Muslim is pointed to as the outside, which means that at every point, at every symbolic moment, the Muslim has to disavow everybody that is Muslim. So that the Muslim has to continuously disavow and consent to the state's illiberal actions, surveillance, imprisonment, imperial action, and much more, so that they could feel like they're part of the inside. And so now I want to turn it to Dr. Sadeghi.
Wow. Yeah, that was good. We need a mixtape for sure. Wow. You really set the context. I don't even know what to say. Thank you so much for being here. As Yousef said, this is a joint project. This is actually the second time I'm presenting in front of a majority Iranian audience, and it is very exciting and different for me. I don't know about the rest of the folks in this room. So it's exciting because oftentimes I am presenting in front of sociologists who, as Neda said, don't really know the Iranian case. And when they don't know the Iranian case, the research may not seem as, I don't know, complicated, exciting, important, critical as it should. So how do we see this process taking place amongst Iranians in Germany? So I have been working on the Iranian diaspora in Hamburg, Germany, and Northern and Southern California since my dissertation research of the summer of 2010. When the refugee crisis happened in 2015 throughout Europe, we call it the global refugee crisis, but it hit the European states so severely, I couldn't help but wonder what the acceptance of over 1.2 million refugees in Germany was going to impact existing Iranians who had been living there for 30, 40 years as the stream of mostly Muslim immigrants coming from Syria, African nations, Iraq, and Afghanistan is coming in. Knowing the work that I had done, I was almost sure this was sending shock waves and tremors of even fear and stuff among Iranians because of the community's ability at that point to have felt that while they will never be Germans, at least we're good foreigners. We're close to being good foreigners. So I hypothesized that if I were to return in the follow-up interviews and talk to the same people I had spoken to in 2010, those narratives would shift. And I'm sure you're not surprised that what? The narratives have shifted drastically. So what I want to talk about now is what I found when I returned to Germany. This was it. Please, Yousef. Thank you. I'm using Silvestre as a German word for New Year's. The German New Year on the 31st of December is huge. Fireworks everywhere. It's huge. I grew up in Germany, so Silvestre is huge. So when I did the follow-up interviews, the respondents kept telling me about Silvestre 2015, Silvestre 2015. And when respondents keep telling you something, you should probably listen because it's important. So they kept telling me something about 2015. And so we're using that event, and I'm going to offer you 2 vignettes as a way to look at how this racialization of Muslims and refugees and this event was talked about and showcased through the German media, and the micro-level tremors this sent through the Iranian community. So this was the event that folks argued had changed the conversation. So throughout my interviews, Silvestre 2015 was mentioned over and over again as a pivotal event that had changed the tide of public opinion against refugees. Buya Gandum had this to say about the event. There was the incident in Cologne during the New Year's 2015 where foreign men were groping and sexually molesting and assaulting women. So when this happened, you see that Germans have become standoffish. Even the people who used to be open-minded are starting to become standoffish and take a step back. What she's arguing is that previously in September 2015, when those refugees were accepted, German society for the most part was arriving, greeting the refugees with flowers, teddy bears, food, and so on and so forth. And there was this humanitarian feeling of, oh, we're going to get through this. But very quickly after this event, there's the creation of a moral panic. So the media heavily reported this incident as a group of primarily foreign men who were publicly sexually harassing and assaulting young women. This created a major outcry around the nation, claiming that these newly accepted refugees were to blame, while others held Middle Eastern cultures and Islam more generally responsible. The research by Beverly Weber in 2016, she did an amazing discourse analysis of the German media around this event, and it showed how the German media and social media accounts responded to the Cologne effect, and what they responded with was an increasingly racist discourse. Isabel also talks about Silvestre 2015 as there was security footage from the disco, and women were crying and saying they were Arabian and trying to rape us. This was a big scandal. After Silvestre, everything changed, and people started writing on social media and Facebook that enough is enough. We took you into our homeland, we helped you, and this is your response to our helping hand. It's not our problem that your religion will not allow you to have relationships with women. Okay. So I would argue that Silvestre 2015 was a racializing process. It was significantly gendered. It's centered on men from the Middle East and of Muslim background. Now, there are a few ways that I can't go through all of them, but I hope to show you 2 vignettes. These are the themes that I have found that Iranians are responding. This is how Iranians are responding to the rising racism and the racialization. 1, they prove themselves. This means they try to symbolically show Germans. Beweisen is a word in German that means to prove yourself. We have to beweisen, and this is about micro-level interactions where they try to prove themselves. So the one I want to read to you is a vignette with Isabel and her dog. Another form of proving oneself to Germans in response to this racialization, importantly, follow-up interviews also revealed that Iranians find themselves putting in more effort to prove to Germans that they are integrated in many ways the good foreigners. This was often subtle and involved some signaling to Germans that Iranians are more likely to be like Germans than new foreigners. For example, when I asked Isabel about her interactions with Germans, she responded, "It is implicit. I try to prove to them I'm like them in more implicit ways. For example, me and my dog. And when I say that my dog is my baby and how I talk to my dog, and then they say, well, in your cultures, I didn't think you liked dogs, or you'd be close with animals. And I'd say, no, this is my baby. I ask her, what does the symbol of the dog hold? What does having a dog say? Okay, she's not a Muslim. Those who are Muslims, they walk away or distance themselves from dogs. And I asked her, is it just about religion or is it culture and tradition too? No. Germans see it as a religious thing, Islam. So Isabel's reaction to the changing climate is to increasingly find ways to signal to Germans that she is culturally similar to them. In this case, her love of dog reduces the social distance between her and Germans. And given the role that dogs play in German society, dogs are very important in Germany. I'm not saying they're not important in America, but there's no one that loves dogs more than Germans. The other one is public interventions to save. This is actually Iranians intervening in the train and telling someone that seems to be new to Germany, don't speak loudly on your phone. Don't eat on the train. You shouldn't do this. Take your feet off the seat. In Germany, we don't put our feet on the seat. They're doing, and when I ask them, and I can't show you right now the vignette, when I ask them what they did, because it saves my face. When Germans are watching, they see me correcting the bad, so it makes me look better. But I also want them to know you can't come into this country and do whatever that you're doing. You're going to ruin it for all of us. So I would argue that these responses also produce then what? Increased racial ethnic differentiation, meaning if Iranians prior to the refugee crisis felt like good foreigners, and by the way, the good foreigner is always the distance from the Turkish. There's a reason for that. I can't go into it right now, but so it creates more differentiation, we're better than, and a hierarchy, and the boundaries between established migrant populations, Iranians who've been there for quite a decade, and the new refugees, I would argue, may widen because Iranians are trying to walk away from this severe racialization. That's all I have right now.
Thank you. I just want to compliment all of you guys. I know we could have conversations for many hours about this, so I appreciate you guys trying to fit it into our time frame. Next, we're going to go to Dr. Sahar Razavi from Sacramento State University. She's going to talk about race and anti-blackness among Iranian Americans. Dr. Razavi.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? All right. First, like many people have said, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to the center, to Dr. Karim for putting this space together. I know a lot of people's work went into it, but I want to particularly thank Dr. Karim. This is amazing that we have this opportunity to be here together. So this is part of a larger project on racial identity among Iranian Americans. As earlier, I don't know where she is, Mona Khadrazi mentioned, Iranians in the diaspora are a deeply varied group with respect to racial and ethnic identification. The racial formations that have long shaped Iranian society play an enduring role in the ways that Iranians in the United States see their own place as racialized individuals in the collective social body. Race itself is a highly contested and contentious issue among Iranian Americans, with divisions across generations, ethnic groups, and religious affiliations, though the process of racialization is somewhat distinct in Iran, such that it is sometimes not legible to those in the diaspora with limited experience in Iran, like myself. While Iranian Americans' liminal and contingent whiteness, as the phenomenal Neda Maqbooleh has called it, has become increasingly salient in the political landscape, Iranian American perceptions of blackness have garnered less scholarly attention. Blackness and anti-blackness among diasporic Iranian communities, and Iranian Americans in particular, presents a rich historical and political area of research for those seeking to investigate race and identity. Central to questions about how diasporic Iranian communities self-identify with respect to race is a history of anti-blackness in Iranian society, which itself finds origins in the enslavement of Africans by Iranians and the subjugation of African diasporic communities in Iran. And again, we are in the presence of greatness. Bita Baghalizadeh has written about this extensively, shedding light on the black-faced figure Haji Firuz, who is beloved, we'll call it, by Iranians who largely prefer to deny that he is, in fact, a minstrel character. This anti-blackness in Iranian society manifests itself in historically and socially specific ways when Iranians come to the United States and assimilate into the racial hierarchies that constitute American society. This project begins with the understanding that Iranian racial formations develop independently of those of the United States and seeks to address the question of how those racial formations map onto those of the United States among Iranian American communities when Iranian immigrants settle in the US. The project further seeks to support an ongoing effort toward a deeper understanding that may reveal the nature, support an ongoing effort to reveal a deeper understanding about the nature of race and social inequality. From the literature on Iranian racial formations, there emerged two positions, essentially. Behnoz Mirzai argues that although there was a slave trade in Iran and a tradition of African slavery which did not end until emancipation in 1929, Afro-Iranians do not perceive themselves as a distinct social identity, and more importantly for this paper, that they are not perceived as distinct by society at large. Anti-black racism is thus cast as a Western problem, one which does not plague Iran because African slaves were supposedly integrated into Iranian society after slavery was officially abolished. More recent work by Mirzai seems to acknowledge that there are some indications that Afro-Iranians may not have experienced universal social integration. They often want to be treated and perceived as Iranian while they remain somewhat segregated and treated as outsiders or imposters by non-African Iranians. On the other side of this debate, Baghalizadeh argues that, in fact, enduring artifacts of anti-black racism in Iran reflect the ongoing legacies of slavery and racialized social hierarchies. She suggests that in spite of attempts to differentiate American plantation slavery from the forms found in Iran, slavery was intimately associated with blackness and was further subject to systematic attempts at erasure so as to whitewash racism in Iran. Rather than being a product of socialization in the United States and its attendant racial hierarchies, racial hostility toward those perceived to be non-white and the embrace of a white identity is not uncommon in Iran. Reza Zia Ebrahimi's account of Iranian enthusiasm toward a distinctly European notion of Aryan identity takes on even more relevance upon examination of Iran's long history of anti-black racism. This particular antipathy toward blackness and embrace of European notions of Aryanness is rooted in the as yet still understudied history of African slavery in Iran. While Iranian slavery was different than North American and Latin American slavery in its centrality to the building of an economic foundation, it has nonetheless had an extraordinary impact on social relations. As in the US, there is a racial hierarchy wherein whiteness is at the social apex and blackness disproportionately disadvantaged. The classed dimensions of religiosity are also similar across the two countries, with an inverse correlation between affluence and educational status on the one hand and religiosity on the other. Iranians' conception of themselves as Aryan is a central factor in the othering of Afro-Iranians and their prejudice against people of African descent globally. Quote, as Iranians viewed themselves as more and more white, they viewed Africans as more and more black, end quote, from Yalzadeh. Iranian identification with whiteness is a requisite and permissive condition for the anti-black attitudes held by Iranian Americans. In other words, viewing themselves as white, they immediately locate themselves within the American racial schema as superior to black Americans. Yalzadeh's work is essential to understanding how Iranian racial formations telegraph outward when Iranians migrate to the United States. The next stage of this project is the empirical component, which will include surveys and case studies. I just want to outline a couple of key hypotheses about what I think will emerge during this stage. Given the historical recency of a unified national Iranian identity and the prevalence of ethnic or tribal identification among Iranians, it's likely that Iranian Americans whose familial ethnic background holds minority status in Iran have stronger ties to their identity than those belonging to the dominant Fars group. In other words, I think that people who hold some minoritized statuses or classifications in the Iranian context will have stronger ties to their Iranianness than those who come from the dominant groups in Iran. So if you are Baha'i, if you're Jewish in Iran, if that's your family background, you're more likely to be aware of those and cognizant of how those are shaping your identity and hold them closer to you once you come to the United States. I predict that people belonging to dominant Shia Fars groups in Iran, when they come here, are more likely to identify with this Aryan myth of Iranian whiteness. I want to close by explicitly stating my intentions. Contrary to the experience someone mentioned earlier of this trans-regional solidarity in the post-9/11 United States with people of Arab descent, for example, my own experience and the evidence I've encountered suggests that as a whole, Iranians in the United States, after 9/11 especially, have doubled down on whiteness. In some cases, tripled down on whiteness by aggressively and publicly distancing themselves from Islam or Muslims, in the same ways as past immigrant groups who have purchased membership into whiteness at the direct expense of black folks. Since Iranians find themselves in an in-between or liminal space, this presents a crucial opportunity for us to ally ourselves with other communities of color politically, because as we know, race is an essentially political and contingent and socially produced identity, so as to break down the larger structures of white supremacy and violent coercive apparatuses of the state which damage and limit us. So just like we ask of our Euro-American friends, call out your racist uncle who's engaging in Persian chauvinism against Arabs or Afghans, or your cousin who's super proud of how much more civilized and evolved he is compared with those Muslims that he left behind. And yes, in case you're wondering, these are people in my extended family. Organize in support of the Oscar Grants, John Crawfords, and Rekia Boyds that this system continues to produce. Think critically and creatively about how we can use our individual and collective privilege to break down the systems affording us that privilege, a space that we occupy precisely because we are in between. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Moving on, again, save your questions. I know that we all have a lot of thoughts and questions, but questions specifically, I don't think we have time for comments. Comments will be for the wine and cheese hour. So we're going to move on to Dr. Shirin Vossoughi from Northwestern University. She's going to be speaking on educational self-determination in the Iranian diaspora, tracing intergenerational forms of anti-racist dialogue.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to start by saying how grateful I am for this space, but also to be in conversation with this panel and to be learning from this panel currently and also in the run-up to the conference. So I'm going to be talking about race and racialization in the context of parenting in the diaspora, and the specific questions and challenges raising children poses for Iranian parents and elders in the United States, many of whom are continuing to wrestle with their own racial identities. And I want to start out by saying that I think of parenting expansively. There's often a construction of parenting in the context of the nuclear family that's very often heteronormative. And I think, as other people have mentioned, there's a wider practice of parenting carried out by a range of elders and extended family members within communities. So in 2016 and 2017, I organized a series of intergenerational dialogues on race, identity, and parenting in the context of a weekend Persian language and community program that I had also worked in as an educator. We had 4 dialogues with a smaller group of youth, a middle school student and a high school student, parents, as well as a grandmother whose grandchildren were in the school. And these 4 dialogues involved talking about issues of race and racism and identity among children in the diaspora, but they also involved organizing together a larger workshop for the larger parental community, which was about 30 participants at the school. These dialogues were part of a national project organized by the Family Leadership Design Collaborative, which is working to develop critical approaches to educational justice and family well-being among communities of color in the U.S. This work seeks to move beyond research and practice on families to research and practice with families that builds from their knowledge, experiences, and priorities for change. The timeline for our dialogues coincided with the election of Donald Trump as president and the subsequent Muslim ban and the Women's March following the inauguration, political events that figured prominently in the discussions that emerged. Our conversations mostly took place in Farsi, although people moved between Farsi and English, and the excerpts that I'll be discussing are translated into English. I want to say just really quickly that my broader work as an ethnographer involves the close study of moment-to-moment talk and interaction within learning environments that support young people to engage in expansive forms of political education and imagination. And I'm really interested in the forms of thinking and relationality and historical action that emerge over time for people as they engage in these kinds of learning environments. And so for me, bringing these lenses to bear on these audio recordings of the dialogues that were among parents and youth and elders within the community meant working to understand the intergenerational forms of meaning-making and social analysis that emerged over time. And I just want to say that I think this temporal piece is important because of the ways different kinds of stories and questions were shared through the building of collective trust, narratives that may not have emerged through an individual one-time interview. And I'm especially interested in what these forms of meaning-making can teach us about the intersections of parenting and racial identity within the diaspora and the complex forms of personhood and sociopolitical learning and becoming Iranians raising children and grandchildren outside Iran are experiencing. Key here are the ways research on diasporic education typically focuses attention on young people and second-generation immigrants, those understood to be negotiating various forms of cultural and epistemic violence and in-betweenness. Though youth, particularly those contending with marginalization, undoubtedly engage in specific and sometimes intensified forms of identity work, less attention has been given to the ongoing processes of identity formation among adults. In this case, first-generation immigrant parents making sense of and negotiating their own cultural and sociopolitical subjectivities. So early on in our dialogues, we spent time describing what led us to bring our children to the school and what participants believed to be the central educational and social needs of children growing up in the diaspora. Resonant with Rouzbeh Shirazi's study of community education, parents expressed a desire for forming community in ways that go beyond language learning. This included maintaining relationships with other Iranians, including elder relatives, and cultivating a deeper sense of cultural belonging. Discussing race and racial identity also led many participants to consider how such educational spaces can support children in learning how to defend themselves, both interactionally and internally, against various forms of racism and racialized bullying. During our first dialogue, Akbar, one of the fathers in the group, stated, "I am looking to the educational institutions, the Farsi school, or even his school, his son's school. I'm not saying I'm a complete parent who knows what to do in this situation. I'm asking you to teach me or to teach my son how to respond to these things. Tell him, you are Iranian and you are Muslim. If they say this to you, you can respond in this way." Akbar's "I'm not a complete parent," he said, "Man nemigam pedar kamel hastam," was one of the first explicit requests for support from the group, and one that helped sow the seeds for reciprocal forms of vulnerability further downstream. Akbar and his son had recently moved to the US from the Netherlands, and he often posed questions to the group to learn more about the political and educational context in the US. As the group generated ways of supporting their children to respond to racism, they also worked to disentangle self-defense from the politics of respectability. Later in the same session, Akbar said, "What can I say to my son to help him defend against this type of discrimination? For example, what if someone says to him, 'You ride camels in Iran,' or 'Women can't drive in Iran,' or worse, make fun of his name, or call him with a different name? This is very important to me, for my son to learn how to respond and defend himself against these types of comments." A few of the other participants responded by reaffirming the need for children to know their histories and the quote-unquote good aspects of Iran. And I think this relates to what Yousef offered in terms of this kind of imperative to disavow in the moment. And Rahim, one of the other fathers in the group, offered a different perspective. So when someone says, "You ride camels in your country," the kids should say, "Yes, our country is so big that in some parts they ride camels, in other parts they ride horses, and in some parts they drive cars. You don't have this type of diversity in your country." Here I want to point out that I think parents' engagement in collective problem solving around racialization did not just take the shape of generating strategies for quote-unquote inclusion. It also allowed for participants to critically analyze the political layers embedded within proposed responses and their implications for children's sense of selfhood. Though complicated in its own ways, Rahim's amendment turned the tables from a stance of defensiveness to one of cultural dignity and a critique of presumed American superiority. Understood in light of the other comments that Rahim made throughout the dialogues, his interjection also suggests that parents' own histories of critique with regard to US imperialism may mediate their approach to parenting and racial identity in important ways. Though parents in the group did not explicitly claim whiteness as a racial category for themselves, and a few asserted that I'm not Amrikai and I will never become Amrikai, they were often engaging in complex and sometimes contradictory discourses about race. When I asked participants about their own experiences with racial discrimination, Parisa, a mother of two, initially responded by adamantly stating that while she believed others had experienced these things, she herself had not. She went so far as to say that some people use the race card too often, an example of the coded ways anti-blackness showed up within the dialogues. Yet within the very same comment, Parisa went on to explain that her white parents-in-law did not accept her because she's Iranian. 3 months later, Parisa shared with the group that her son's kindergarten teacher does not like him because he's Iranian. When pressed by other concerned parents about how she knows this, she shared a number of stories, including that her 5-year-old son's teacher told her he had left the bathroom stall door open and that perhaps this was due to his culture. Though participants encouraged Parisa to confront the teacher, she expressed a fear that it would make matters worse for her son's experience in his classroom. She said, "He has my child for 8 hours a day and he can do many things." Her response aligns with what we know about how parents of color wrestle with confronting white teachers and the power dynamics between schools and families. One interpretation of Parisa's shifting comments is to consider how people may resolve the contradiction of adamantly denying racism and proceeding to recount clear instances of racism by sidestepping race as the logic undergirding the actions of Parisa's in-laws or her son's kindergarten teacher. Though not mutually exclusive, a different interpretation that I want to offer is that these tensions may signal emergent or deepening forms of meaning-making and learning. This second perspective suggests that Parisa may have been publicly reevaluating or taking exception to her own initial remark regarding the denial of racism and may offer more in terms of the potentials for learning and co-thinking embedded in such narratives. It also speaks to the possibility that Iranian parents and elders may have less frequent opportunities to engage in explicit discussions about race with one another and with the younger generation. So I want to close by sharing that parents in the group often asked for resources in knowing how to respond to young children who are wondering about their skin color or learning to value normative standards of beauty and language. And at the same time, many expressed the belief that early childhood may be too soon for these discussions about race. The group agreed that older children should be having these conversations, but they often worried that opening them up with younger children would plant the idea in their minds that they were quote-unquote different, or that any slight had to do with their Iranianness. As Maqbula has argued, this language of difference is the language of race and always has been. We work to problematize the idea of difference as deficit within the larger school workshop, sharing research that stresses the importance of talking with children about race from a very early age, particularly in a society highly organized around racial hierarchy. Within this larger workshop, Surush, one of the other fathers, took exception to this issue of difference as a negative thing. And he said, "My son sees himself as difference and never saw it as a bad thing. In fact, he thought of it as a good thing." The parental impulse to protect children from painful encounters with racial othering and white supremacy is real. At the same time, supporting children in the diaspora to have political clarity about what Yousef and Sahar have referred to as their outsider position in the US opens possibilities for deeper forms of collective confidence, self-determination, and solidarity with other racialized communities. In my view, these possibilities require that we attune more closely to the ongoing processes of identity formation among parents and elders in the Iranian diaspora community, and that we understand children as complex thinkers and political actors who are actively making sense of race and racialization. As Ishimaru and Bang have argued, our aim is whole, healthy children within healthy families and communities who know and practice their culture, understand power, and can determine their own future. So I'll just end by thanking the folks that participated in these dialogues and the director of the school that supported them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, we're going to have Anna Ghoreishian. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona, and she's going to talk about another vision, the Iranian diaspora, social justice, and the making of cosmopolitan imagined communities. There you go.
Thanks. Oh, I'm going to borrow your. Thanks to Bijan Georgiani, who reminded me, I am going to begin by remembering the victims and survivors of the floods that are still going on in Iran as of 23 hours ago, last I checked. So the idea of this project, which is actually a very new project, came to me because faced with the rise of nationalist movements, I noticed that my community, which includes more than just diasporic Iranians, did not relate to nationhood through traditional markers, but instead they were more transnational and focused on social justice issues. So I wanted to locate these phenomena in relation to Benedict Anderson's classic text, Imagined Community, and Ulrich Beck's Cosmopolitan Imperative. So in Imagined Community, Anderson described nation as an imagined political community where our sense of belonging is based on intentional constructs of perceived shared characteristics like language, national identity, and so on. But of course, as we know, these are concepts that were very much created at the cost of other realities. And especially today, more than ever, mass migration and global crisis and digital age complicates Anderson's imagined community. So it's no surprise that Ulrich Beck revisited Anderson's imagined community in Cosmopolitan Imperative, where he argued that future communities will inevitably formulate around global risk and the imperative of survival. So my project builds on Anderson and Beck's work and suggests that some future imagined communities can potentially be built around issues of social justice. For the purpose of demonstrating the transnational sense of belonging that these Iranian diasporic subjects had and the centrality of social justice, I interviewed members of my extended community who are across, first generation to second generation diasporic Iranians, and they live across the globe, including Germany, US, and Egypt. I noticed that despite the differences in their backgrounds, in part these individuals, their renegotiations of their selves have led to a transnational belonging and a commitment to social justice. This sense of transnationalism and centrality of social justice are in part reflective in how these individuals remember memories, objects, and experiences. And by remembering, I'm not necessarily just referring to recalling, but how these individuals continuously make new meaning that push them into new spaces of inclusivity. that include Iranianness, Americanness, and beyond. And it is in this context that they pursue social justice, not as a lofty idea, but because their sense of selves and their resiliencies are dependent on such pursuit. So I'm going to read to you two narratives just to give you a sense of what I'm doing. Forgive me if I start crying. Raha. She was born a year before the 1979 revolution and immigrated to US when she was 5.5 years old. She describes her parents as thinkers, as a poet and a teacher. Before she went back to Iran, she did not remember much but fleeting moments, the scent of Iranian pizza or the sound of the red alert sirens during the Iran-Iraq war. One of her distinct memories is of, quote, men hitting their backs with chains, unquote. She remembers the 1979 revolution through the experiences of her parents and community. She associates the feeling of longing and guilt with the revolution and the act of leaving, longing for hope and for something that was supposed to happen but didn't, and carrying guilt about who got to come and who was left behind. She feels like she lives in the shadow of the revolution. It changed our lives, and I don't even have a memory of it, she says. Perhaps most of all, she connects her politicization with pain. She has an intense sense of pain around the act of leaving Iran. I can't explain it. I don't remember, but I absolutely know what was lost. The work that I do now is very much about addressing that pain. Low-income immigrants, communities, people who are being persecuted by multiple governments. It's not about doing the right thing. I do this work because I am broken too. Something about us connecting the disconnected pieces. Leila. She was born a few years before the 1979 revolution to a white American mother and an Iranian father from a conservative Muslim family. She describes her parents as falling in love before they realized that they were not supposed to. Her father's family included one uncle who was in the Revolutionary Guard and participated in the American hostage-taking. She remembers her uncle taking her to anti-American demonstrations. She remembers her mother baking cakes and getting her Revolutionary Guard uncle to sneak in those cakes for the American hostages. She tells me that despite the regime's hostilities toward her American mother, they stayed well into the Iran-Iraq war. She immigrated to the United States when she was 9, and unlike Raha in the United States, she had a seemingly easy time assimilating. I was like any other white girl, she says, but she also felt that she left her language and culture back in Iran. She had to work through a lot of shame about not being Iranian enough and leaving everything behind. She sees herself as someone who is borderless. About her work, she says, the refugees see this little whitey physician, and I want them to know that I will take care of them like they are my sisters and brothers. And so this presentation is part of my insistence to name my hope. And my hope, which is the work of a lifetime, is to be involved in the work of creating ethical solidarities which can deliver into imagined communities of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you for the great work that you do. We're going to have some time for some questions, but if you would permit me, I'd like to pose a question to the panel, and folks can chime in as you'd like or as you want or not if things occur to you. Given the work that you all do, given the work that many of us do in this room, and we've heard about a lot of great work being done on this issue, how do we use this work, this body of work, to engage and mobilize our community in a meaningful way, given some of the things we discussed earlier around the advocacy points and things that that we are dealing with and trying to organize around, right? And the hatred we face and the violence and discrimination we often face, and our understanding of our own race and racialization in the diaspora. How do we use this body of work to mobilize and engage our community? Is it having more intergenerational dialogues, so having that be a part of what's done, in our communities, having more conferences like this, hint, hint, with the broader community, having Nida come and speak at every event we do. Do folks have any thoughts about how we really bridge this gap between this great work and research you all are doing and what is taking place in our communities in the diaspora?
So I think it's something that everybody chimed in, calling out our relatives and accountability. The thing that I just want to highlight is this is not something that we will do once or twice or you engage in it occasionally. This is a way of life. We have to be accountable continuously 24/7, and we have to hold each other accountable, and we have to be open, and we have to be vulnerable to be able to go through those transformative spaces.
Any other thoughts?
Well, if I may, I actually think, I don't know, sometimes I think I'm too optimistic, I don't know. I actually think we're in a really interesting moment right now. What I mean by that is I feel like when things get really bad out there with regard to politics is when some communities really show up and show themselves. So I actually have quite a bit of optimism that as things have gotten increasingly worse since the election of the president, I think Iranians are, for the most part, at least from my follow-up interviews with those Iranians in the U.S. that I've been doing 2017 and 2018 since the election, I actually think they're having more conversations than they ever have. I think one thing for Iranians, at least from what I can tell, is they have to get over the shock of why this country went against them. From what I find in my follow-up interviews, Iranians are shocked. We're integrated, we've done so well. Why would they do us? Why would they lump us with Yemenis? Why would they lump us with those people? So one thing is, in order to engage and mobilize, we have to really understand our own identity, where we come from, what we stand for. And I think, so mobilization as a long-term measure, not short-term measure, really happens with a very clear understanding of who we are in our history in this nation, prior to the revolution, going back to Mossadegh, and really understanding where Iranians at. The other thing is, I actually have a lot of faith in the first generation. I think if we give first generation people the space to be vulnerable and tell us their trauma, we don't even know what the first generation really went through in the hostage crisis. I know people think they do. The data is really, meaning the first generation, in my opinion, got here and they tried just to survive and to hold on. So when we didn't get some of the socialization at home in these conversations, I don't think it's because they weren't unaware. It's too painful. Most people left with the suitcase thinking they're going to go back. So we have a lot of work to do, I think, with talking about first generation people, what their pain is, what their trauma is. Why do they want to have these conversations? People don't have these conversations just for the sake of it. They're not having it because it's painful. It's painful. So I think we need to get to the pain. I would like to get to the pain to get to the healing. We haven't dealt with the pain.
And just to kind of piggyback on my partner here, I think that's where the disavowal comes from too.
Yes.
That like the move away, the assertion of difference, whether that's an assertion of difference from Arab or fundamentally the assertion of difference from Muslim, is about the trauma of Iran and what happened over there, and the inability of still figuring out how to deal with that. Because the fundamental way that you deal with anti-Muslim racism is not to create difference, but to actually see being part of it. Because it's no longer, being Muslim is no longer about believing in Muhammad and Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali and Hassan and Hussein. It's about being racialized as Muslim. So if somebody tells you, are you Muslim? Yeah, sure, why not? Are you Iranian? Yeah, I'm Iraqi too, I'm Palestinian, I'm all of those things. That we need to confront disavowal with not disavowing people. So, and that means that you have to deal with the trauma. And there's no easy answer for that. And I think this is a question that probably some of the folks working on the ground, the teachers and the mobilizers also probably have a lot to say.
I just want to underline what you said, Sahar, about the pain. And I just want to add that I think it's also a methodological imperative and question for us. Like, if I had stopped at that first one or two dialogues, we wouldn't have gotten those stories. And we probably scratched the surface of what people shared in terms of their own histories of experience. And we know this, right? That like our parents have been on the front line of experiencing racial discrimination in ways that we don't also. So I think that it's a question for us as researchers of, how do we hear those narratives? How do they come forward? And then what is our ethical and political responsibility when those narratives are shared?
Also, I just want to say, like, in addition to like narratives of pain, I think that we should also foreground narratives of solidarity from the past as well, in talking about this stuff, especially with like second generation Iranian Americans. So while I'm not watching PBS children's TV shows, I also look at historical documents, and I've come across newsletters, you know, both pre and post-revolutionary, from like the Iranian Students Association, for example, that show wide solidarity with larger third world movements and American Indian movements and Black Power movements. So this tradition of organizing is not new. Our community has always been a part of it, or at least part of our community has always been a part of it. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Pardon?
You did a good job with that question.
Oh, thank you. So we're going to open it up. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions. And then, of course, whoever's around, you know, we can continue the dialogue after the panel is officially done. But anyone have anything to ask? I see a hand over there. Yes.
I'm pretty loud, so.
It's okay. You can
just shout. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, I can use the mic. I'll be quieter if I use the mic. Obviously, since you guys brought up this idea of trauma and pain having to do with 1979, having to do with the revolution, right? The idea of diaspora is tied back to the homeland, it's tied back to Iran. And what I find, at least in my work, is that there's this paralysis amongst Iranians, because if we accept our racialization as Muslims, as part of Islam, then we're somehow connecting that to the government in Iran, right? And so how do we, because this is a genuine question because I have to deal with it all the time, how do we reconcile that, right? Like, how do I have a conversation with somebody where I'm not an apologist for the Islamic Republic because I'm saying, hey, the Muslim ban is racist, or we should prevent war with Iran because this is another colonial American like agenda. How do we reconcile the political with kind of what you guys are talking about?
I'm gonna let you take that.
So, you know, this reminds me of when I was organizing against the Iraq War in New York City, and it was this supposedly, you know, progressive Trotskyist group, and they insisted that we did not in any way criticize Saddam, because if you criticize Saddam, that meant that you were for the Iraqi war. And it always really frustrates me because I think we're a lot more sophisticated, right? Okay, so you come up with your way of articulating or distinguishing, but Muslim has many narratives, especially now we know that there are a lot of political narratives. I myself claim my Muslimness whenever needed be, and, you know, then don't claim it when I don't need to. So it's yours. Muslimness is yours. And certainly you can distinguish it from the regime. The regime does not have the monopoly on Muslimness. We know that. And so, I mean, that's how I see it.
I want to add, too, that for me, the essential answer to that question goes back to the previous panel about solidarity. The way that you get around identification with an Islamic state is to ally yourself with the people who live there. That necessarily, it has to create a separation between the population and the state. So if we have our eye to solidarity to begin with, then there's no way that defending Muslims, or what I call Muslim adjacent people, can be read as a defense of an Islamic state, because the two, once you identify who you're actually in solidarity with, then the question sort of becomes moot.
Can I give an incomplete or terrible answer to an important question? I have three thoughts. One, I want to say that I think for me, the trauma doesn't just come from 1979. I feel like the trauma comes from, for me, the failure of a third world imaginary, of creativity, of political imagination, of imagining what another world could be. And that wasn't just the Iranian Revolution. That was previous to the Iranian Revolution. That was all of the different leftist parties. That was all the different iterations of thoughts that was being created, thought about, experimented with. In some ways, what we were robbed of is our ability to experiment with ideas. And we've always been robbed of our abilities to experiment, to see if it works or not, to have trial and error. Because the second we tried to have a trial and error, there was an army, there was the CIA, there was the whoever that was going to force us not to have those experimentations. So for the trauma, like, I don't think 1979 is just the day that there is a history before and there is a history after. That's one thought. Two, I wonder how much the racism that we feel when it comes from the racists and here the state, I don't think it's really about Iran. It's only about Iran for us. For that, they don't even know what Iran is. That part of racism on the part of the United States, I say this to my classes all the time, that nobody in the foreign policy establishment in the United States understands what Iran, Iraq, or anywhere in the Middle East is. That if you read the memoirs of Americans who were in Iraq itself, Paul Bremer and all these people, when they're sitting in Iraq talking to Iraqis, they didn't actually see Iraqis or Iraq. They had this mythical imaginary of what Iraq was that then they repeated and they enacted policies. It's as if you enact policy on an imagined place that doesn't actually exist anywhere in the world. So that when they talk about racism, when racism operates, it's not about Iran. It's about a mythical place. It's about Iran to us. But then we don't need to then respond to them about the place for us. We need to respond to them about their shortcomings. Because the problem with racism in the United States is about the shortcoming of liberalism. It's about the shortcoming of the United States. It's about the shortcoming of the political economic establishment in the United States. It has nothing to do with Iran, Iraq, the Middle East, Islam, any of those ideas. And the third, I think, maybe part of the beginning process is about creativity. How do we rekindle, go back to our historic past and to be able to excavate the dreams of our previous thinkers, artists, cultural producers, not to then repeat the past, because we shouldn't repeat the past because time has changed, but to be able to get ourselves around the foreclosure of creativity that's been now forced upon us, so that when they say Muslim, they already have a definition for us, and we don't even know what the definition is for us. So I think there was a playground of ideas amongst Iranian scholars. I mean, I'm just beginning to barely understand what, like, the work of Ali Shariati because of my friends here. And I read somebody like Ali Shariati and I look at what he's dealing with, and it's like, wow, he's playing around with ideas that are so sophisticated, and yet we are tied, we foreclose ourselves and we discipline our political imaginary. So I think the response needs to be like, break out of that and find that new political imaginary, that the third world project in the past, can we rekindle a new third world internationalism today?
Okay.
Ali Shariati is and was part of the problem. But before you mentioned Ali Shariati, what I was going to say is that, unlike you, I have the experience as someone who lived in Canada when the hostage crisis was happening. And I heard a lot about the victimization of Iranians here. And then, you know, through contacts with the State Department, whenever you have on panels people from the State Department, they really felt humiliated by Iran. I don't think we can really cast that aside and say, when you think of Iran in terms of policy, for them it's always the hostage crisis.
Do you have a question?
No, I was just going to respond to this, that I think that you are really forgetting very significant moments.
I think there was a question here. If we can get the mic over, thank you.
سلام علیکم من بهار میخک هستم. Thank you so much for everybody. I'm learning a lot. And I wanted to specifically talk to the same conversation. I just want to share humbly what I do. I'm a faculty here at San Francisco State University, but I'm not in the humanities. Not in the. I teach epidemiology. I did grow up during the Iran-Iraq war, so I was a refugee with my family. But, anyways, I love how you guys said, make ourselves vulnerable. I'm gonna try to do that here. I was frustrated by all the misconceptions about Islam and all these things that being, I grew up Muslim and everything, so I decided that I have to study the Quran myself, and I really felt like I was responsible to really understand it and really be able to answer. So that the woman that one of the things that your topics was about dogs and how she handled it.
Yeah.
I thought that was clever, but I think I've been put. I love dogs, and I, worked with shelter dogs and everything. The misconception is that Muslims are like, they say dogs are najis and dirty, whatever, right? So I was like, that doesn't make sense. Well, God, why would God say something like that? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. So I read the text, and I realized that nowhere in the Quran there's any verse that you can find that says avoid dogs and mistreat them the way that some Muslims in Muslim countries do. Sure. Then on top of that, God points out in several verses, which I have as proof, so you don't say like this is Bahar's opinion, because we don't go by opinion. We have to show proof. We have to show the exact verse of why we're saying something, and so God actually is telling us like these animals are created for you. Use them; they're your good company. What God uses is He uses the story of the people of the cave. I'm not sure if you know who the people of the cave are.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We have a few minutes.
Yeah.
If you can,
read the verse
is there a question attached to it?
I just want to share, because we are sharing and thinking of creative ways to handle this culture of.
Can you make it?
I'm going to try. Yeah, but I'm going to read the verse because it's really important to actually read the verse. It's Surah 18. Verse 22, some would say they were 3, their dog being the 4th, while others would say 5, the 6th being their dog, as they guessed. Others said 7, and the 8th was their dog. Say, my Lord is the best knower of their number. Only a few knew the correct number. Therefore, do not argue with them. Just go along with them. You need not consult anyone about this. So I just wanted one last thing that it's really important. I think a lot of Iranians don't understand that a lot of these things, like the hadiths about dogs are being dirty, they're like false hadiths, they're fabrications. And if you cannot find it in the Quran, you should not believe it. You should not say, and that's my last point.
I do want to complete your comment, and just to say the dog thing is an approximation of assimilation.
Yeah.
Iranians that want to be close to Germans will eat pepperoni on their pizza with pork.
Sure.
They will drink wine. They will do all kinds of things to symbolically show Germans that I'm like you.
Yeah,
so it's not, my comment was not that Islam or dogs. It was that in Germany, more than the United States, dogs hold very high social currency.
Yeah.
So having a dog is a way to get closer. I'm sure Isabel loves her dog.
Yes.
But it was about the ways in which she uses the dog at the dog park to get close to Germans.
Of course.
So it's not necessary that I believe that the Quran has.
No, of course. It was a clever way.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thanks for.
Thank you. Persis, what's our time check? One more question. I saw a hand over in that corner.
Hi, thank you all so much. This has been really wonderful. As a member of a number of diasporas, I've noticed that a lot of the narrative around Iranian diaspora is very Persian-centric, and definitely prioritizes an understanding of Iranian and Persian as sort of interchangeable terms when that's not true. And there's a lot of discourse about diaspora Iranians identifying with Iranian or Persian at different points in history. Mike and Dr. Razavi mentioned this at some point, that there are minority groups within Iran who come and have a different relation to Iranianness, which is a term. But my question to you all as scholars of race, ethnicity, and racialization in the diaspora, is about your experiences with non-Persian Iranians in the diaspora communities that you have worked with and engaged with. And how have you engaged with the multiplicities of non-Persian Iranian identities in a diaspora that often homogenizes Persian identity and replicates and recreates social stratification that is tied to understanding of Persian nationalism within the framework of Iran?
If I may, real quick, although my work is, so when I was interviewing Iranians in Northern and Southern California, of course in Southern California, not surprisingly, I rub up against Iranian Jews, Iranian Baha'is, and Iranian Armenians. So although my work is not necessarily on that identity formation and how that works, I will say one thing. And I think it was you I think it was you that said that they are more likely to, your hypothesis is that, well, there's the data, right? The data, at least my interview data, shows that those who are non-Persian Iranians do hold on to those markers more strongly, and there's a reason for that. But there's also that those communities, meaning Iranian Jewish communities, Armenian communities, from what I have seen, they also pull a lot on those members, meaning the socialization that goes into it is one of pride in many ways that we Iranian Persians do not. So one aspect is like the push and pull. How much is the community doing this, and how much is it a remnant of coming out of Iran and thus having to create ethnic enclaves? Because we see the same thing with Ashkenazi Jews in all of the Northeast, right? Holding on to that identity. The other thing about Iranian Jews, from my notice, is really interesting. They do want to be with other Jews, but they better be Iranian Jews. So there's something to be said that's true, that they are interested in being with other Jews, but they want that Iranian ethnic marker. It's the same thing with Armenian Iranians, for what I've seen. They have aspects of culture that's Armenian, right? So my friend, I won't say her name, she's Armenian Iranian, she tells me salad olviye is Armenian Sahar. That is Armenian potato salad, right? So the question becomes, we just have to do more work on that. That's not the work I've done, but I come across it when I do the empirical data, because when I first was interviewing Iranians, I did not say only Persian. My net was really wide, right? Especially in LA. So I want to say there's a lot to be said about this, but that's what I have found, that it seems like they hold on to things in different ways. Was that the question?
Well, so
was that your question?
One of my questions for you actually had been in your work in Germany, working with the Iranian diaspora.
No, they don't say Persian. There's no such thing as Persian. Well, you can't tell a German you're Persian.
No, that's the language in German. I understand. But
right.
my question for you, you talked about how they distance themselves from Turks.
Yes.
And I've seen this in Kurdish communities from Iran and Iraq and Austria, a very similar narrative.
Yes.
Have you ever encountered Azeris from Iran in Germany? So Azeri Iranians,
yes,
Turkic-speaking Iranians in Germany who distance themselves from Turks in the same way.
I don't have enough data to speak. I don't have enough data to tell you whether they do or not.
Can I make a comment?
Go ahead. Wrap it up. No, I don't need to say it. She can. Go ahead.
I think it's really important in our work when we're engaging with this kind of research that we're really precise and careful methodologically, not to flatten those identities, because it only reproduces those same hierarchies racially. I mean, ethnic minorities in Iran, as you know, there are many of them, and they all have power relationships, right? So the stereotype of the Turk khar, idiot Turk, all over Iran, it serves a particular set of power dynamics, right? And so I think it was Michael Jin said earlier, the phrase you used was sameness in dispersion. If we reject that completely, then I think we can start to figure out the texture and the contours of the diaspora better, and then that will reveal more useful information about our identities and how those identities then map onto the power relationships that we're grappling with.
Thank you. I think, am I getting my cue that we need to stop? Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks to this wonderful panel.